So, have you ever wished for a morning beverage that just kind of, hits the absolute perfect sweet spot?
Oh, the ultimate holy grail of morning drinks.
Right. Imagine a drink that gives you the really powerful, eye-opening energy of a strong cup of coffee.
But without feeling like your heart is going to beat out of your chest.
Exactly. And then you add in the well-documented health and antioxidant benefits of a premium green tea. And on top of that, absolutely zero of the bitterness. The kind of bitterness that makes you want to dump a quarter cup of sugar or heavy cream into your mug just to get it down.
Yeah, the classic oversteeped tea problem.
Right. Now, add to all of that a carbon footprint that is essentially zero. It sounds like some kind of futuristic bioengineered super drink cooked up in a Silicon Valley lab.
Yeah, it really does.
Well, what if I told you that this miraculous beverage is actually an ancient native plant? And depending on where you live in the United States, it is probably growing completely wild in your backyard right now. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are incredibly excited to have you with us because today we are exploring the fascinating, forgotten, and frankly, unbelievable story of Yaupon Holly.
It really is an astonishing story, and one that has literally been hiding in plain sight for generations. I mean, Yaupon, which is scientifically known as Ilex vomitoria, holds a very special and unique title.
Yeah, North America's only native caffeinated plant.
Well, sharing that honor only with its very close but significantly less caffeinated botanical cousin, the Yaupon holly. But for thousands upon thousands of years, this simple green shrub was the economic and spiritual center of a massive, continent-spanning civilization,
And then it just vanished.
almost entirely. Through this crazy series of historical accidents, corporate smear campaigns, and deep-seated social prejudices, it practically evaporated from our collective memory.
To truly do this topic justice and give you the full picture today, we've gathered an absolute mountain of source material. I mean, if you could see the table in front of us right now, it is just covered in thick stacks of research.
It's a lot to get through.
It is. We are pulling from comprehensive botanical and agricultural guides from NC State University, cutting-edge economic research from Cornell's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and incredibly detailed historical ethnobotany studies from Florida International University.
We've even been digging into the historical archives.
Yeah, reading the actual diaries of 18th century explorers. Plus, we pulled the mission statements and modern harvesting practices of the pioneers leading the 21st century Yaupon Renaissance. Companies like Rise Yaupon, Cat Spring, Lost Pines, and Gold Holly.
So our mission today is to untangle this 8,000-year-old hidden history. We're going to explore the unique botanical and chemical properties that make this plant a literal super tea, because it functions in ways that modern biohackers spend millions trying to synthesize.
We'll unpack the tragic historical misunderstandings and the calculated class stigmas that nearly erased it from the modern world.
And finally, examine how it is making this massive, well-deserved commercial comeback today as the ultimate sustainable, climate-resilient crop.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. We need to start by just meeting the plant itself because a lot of people listening might have walked right past it this morning.
Oh, most certainly.
Right. If you're hiking through the woods in the Southeastern United States, or even just walking through a suburban park, what are you actually looking for? Because the native range is massive.
It really is. It sweeps in a wide arc from the eastern shore of Virginia, stretching all the way down through the Carolinas and Florida, across the Gulf Coast, into Texas and Oklahoma.
And there's that one weird pocket in Mexico, right?
Yes, there's a disjunct or geographically separated population growing way down in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. Visually, it's quite distinct once you train your eyes to see it, but it also has this remarkable ability to blend perfectly into the dense understory of a southern forest.
So what are the key identifiers?
You're looking for an evergreen shrub, or sometimes a small tree if it's been allowed to grow for a few decades. It has smooth, light gray bark. The young stems actually often have a faint purplish tint before they mature into that silvery gray color.
Okay, and the leaves?
The leaves are quite small, usually only about ½ an inch to 1.5 inches long. They're leathery to the touch, very glossy, and a deep, vibrant dark green.
Now, I think the natural assumption when people hear the word holly is to picture the classic Christmas decoration. You know, those stiff, dark leaves with the sharp, prickly points that hurt your hands when you try to hang them over a doorway.
That is a crucial distinction. Unlike standard Christmas holly, Yaupon leaves do not have those defensive spikes.
Thank goodness.
Right. Instead, they have scalloped or serrated edges. If you run your finger along the side of a leaf, it feels more like the teeth of a tiny, blunt saw. They are completely smooth and not prickly at all.
And what about the berries? That's a big holly identifier.
Yes, that's the other major identifier. But it comes in the late fall and winter. If you stumble upon a female plant during those colder months, you'll see these incredibly vibrant, bright red, slightly translucent berries clustered very tightly along the pale gray stems. It's a visually striking contrast.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The physical look of the plant is undeniably great for landscaping, but the real magic is completely invisible to the naked eye. It's all about the chemistry hidden inside those little green leaves.
The phytochemistry is mind-blowing.
It is. The source material points out that Yaupon possesses a chemical trifecta that makes it arguably superior to almost any other caffeinated plant on Earth. We are talking about the simultaneous presence of caffeine, theobromine, and theocrine.
And that specific chemical profile is what elevates Yaupon from a simple botanical curiosity to a functional powerhouse. Let's look at the caffeine baseline first, just to ground it in something we all know.
Right, how much of a kick are we actually getting here?
A highly detailed, peer-reviewed study conducted by researcher Adam Edwards at Florida International University analyzed the natural variation of these compounds across different wild populations. He found that the caffeine concentration in fresh Yaupon leaves ranges anywhere from roughly 0.00038% to 0.2288% by weight.
Okay, so to pull that out of the laboratory and put it into your morning cup, what does that mean?
It means a typical 8 to 14-ounce serving of traditionally brewed Yaupon tea yields about 25 milligrams of caffeine.
Okay, so for some context for you listening, 25 milligrams is about the same amount of caffeine you would get in a standard cup of green tea. It's roughly a quarter of the caffeine you'd get in a very strong, dark cup of drip coffee.
Or about half of what's in a standard cup of black tea like Earl Grey.
Right. But as anyone who has ever had a massive espresso on an empty stomach and felt their heart vibrating knows, caffeine content alone is only half the story when it comes to how a drink actually makes you feel throughout the day.
What's fascinating here is the specific ratio of these naturally occurring compounds. It's something of a biological holy grail. Yaupon features a naturally occurring 5-to-1 ratio of caffeine to theobromine.
Theobromine. Now, that's a fascinating alkaloid. You might actually recognize the name because it is the primary pleasure molecule found in dark chocolate.
Exactly. It's what gives chocolate that mood-boosting, slightly euphoric quality.
I definitely need an ELI 5.
Yeah.
Explain. Like, I'm 5 on how these two chemicals interact in the human body. Because we know caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant, which is why it wakes us up. But it's also what causes that jittery, anxious, heart-racing feeling if you drink too much of it.
Okay. Think of your circulatory system like a massive interstate highway system. When you consume a heavy dose of pure caffeine, like from a synthetic energy drink or a highly concentrated espresso, it acts as a vasoconstrictor.
Meaning it tightens everything up.
Right. It slightly narrows those blood vessels. It's like shutting down a lane on the highway while simultaneously telling all the cars to drive faster.
Oh, that's a great analogy. That creates a traffic jam.
Exactly. A traffic jam of physical anxiety, elevated heart rate, and jitters. Theobromine, on the other hand, acts in the exact opposite manner. It is a vasodilator.
So it opens things up.
Yes. It relaxes the smooth muscle tissue in your blood vessels, effectively opening up an extra lane on that highway.
So when you combine the caffeine and the theobromine in that specific 5-to-1 ratio, along with a third complementary compound called theophylline, they work together in this beautiful, balancing synergy.
The caffeine gives you the cognitive alertness, but the theobromine widens the pathways, lowering blood pressure and smoothing out the delivery of that energy.
The result is a steady, highly focused, almost joyful lift. You get a sustained period of alertness without the physical anxiety, without the handshaking jitters.
And most importantly, without the infamous 2 p.m. crash that sends coffee drinkers running back to the break room for a second cup. The theobromine essentially acts as a chemical parachute, gently setting your energy levels back down to baseline over several hours.
And beyond just the stimulants, the broader health benefits detailed in these agricultural studies are staggering. Research coming out of the University of Florida found that certain specific cultivars of Yaupon, like the Nana variety, contain as much antioxidant potential as a handful of fresh blueberries.
The leaves are absolutely packed with polyphenols and flavonoids, like chlorogenic acid and rutin.
To contextualize those terms, chlorogenic acid and rutin function essentially as cellular bodyguards.
They are highly regarded in the medical community for their potent anti-inflammatory properties.
Right, and their ability to neutralize free radicals in the bloodstream and their potential to support cardiovascular health. When you brew a cup of this plant, you are essentially drinking a preventative health supplement, an antioxidant powerhouse that just so happens to gently wake you up.
It's the perfect combination.
But wait, we haven't even touched on what I consider the biggest, most practical miracle of this plant for the everyday consumer.
Oh, the tannins.
Yes. If you are a regular tea drinker, you know the absolute tragedy of the forgotten travel mug. You make a beautiful cup of premium green or black tea, you drop the tea bag in, you get distracted by an email or your morning commute, and you leave that bag steeping in the hot water for 20 minutes.
Be well done.
You finally take a sip, and your mouth completely puckers up. It is overwhelmingly bitter, incredibly astringent, and basically undrinkable.
That awful dry mouth sensation is caused by a class of chemical compounds called tannins. Traditional tea, derived from the Asian Camellia sinensis plant, is absolutely loaded with them.
Yaupon, however, has absolutely zero tannins.
And that specific chemical absence fundamentally rewrites the culinary rules for brewing tea. Because it lacks tannins entirely, it is scientifically impossible to oversteep Yaupon.
Wait, literally impossible?
Literally impossible. The concept of a bitter cup simply does not exist with this plant. You can take a tablespoon of ground, roasted Yaupon leaves, drop them into a French press or a mug of boiling water, completely forget about it for 3 hours, come back when it is lukewarm, and it will still be perfectly smooth, crisp, and naturally sweet.
I imagine that also changes how the drink interacts with the human digestive system. Coffee is notoriously acidic, which is a nightmare for a large percentage of the population.
It changes it entirely. The complete lack of tannins, combined with a significantly lower overall acid profile than roasted coffee beans, makes Yaupon incredibly gentle on the stomach lining.
So for people who suffer from acid reflux, GERD, or general stomach discomfort and bloating from their morning coffee habit, making the switch to Yaupon is often a total revelation.
You get the energy without the gastrointestinal distress.
Before we move on, I do want to throw out one very important safety warning here for anyone feeling inspired to run into their local woods immediately to start harvesting. While the leaves and the stems are perfectly safe, non-toxic, and incredibly healthy, you must be careful with the berries.
Yes, do not eat the berries.
Those bright red, beautiful, translucent berries found on the female plants in the winter are mildly poisonous to humans.
The berries contain specific emetic compounds that will cause severe stomach upset, intense nausea, and vomiting if ingested.
So when you are wild harvesting the plant, you have to be meticulous about picking any stray berries out of your collection basket.
The berries are strictly for the birds, and I mean that in the most literal ecological sense. They are a vital, life-saving winter food source for migratory songbirds like cedar waxwings, eastern bluebirds, and northern mockingbirds.
They rely on those berries when insects, other food sources are scarce. So leave the red berries for the wildlife and stick exclusively to the green leaves and stems for your morning tea. So, to summarize where we are, we have this ubiquitous native shrub that is chemically perfect for human consumption, naturally sweet, crash-free, packed with antioxidants, and growing wild right here in North America.
It sounds too good to be true.
It does, and that obviously leads us to the historical timeline. How long have humans actually known about this? Because listening to this chemical profile, it feels like it should be the most popular beverage on the continent, heavily marketed in every grocery store from coast to coast.
The human relationship with this plant stretches back a very, very long time. Archaeological and ethnobotanical records confirm that the indigenous peoples of the southeastern woodlands, a massive, diverse group of cultures including the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminoles, Timucua, Ayers, Chitimacha, and many others, have utilized Yaupon for over 8,000 years.
8,000 years?
It wasn't just a casual beverage or a minor folk remedy either.
Yeah.
It was an absolute cornerstone of their civilizations, deeply woven into the fabric of daily life and sacred ritual.
It served a multitude of purposes, depending on the context, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was used daily as a communal, social beverage shared during important council meetings to keep the chiefs and elders focused during long negotiations.
Kind of like the ancient equivalent of a boardroom coffee pot.
Exactly like that. It was also utilized as a highly concentrated, energizing pre-battle drink for warriors needing a massive stimulant boost. And it was heavily prescribed medicinally by healers to treat wounds, lower fevers, and calm fraying nerves.
The plant was so highly valued, both culturally and practically, that it became the center of a massive, sophisticated, ancient trade empire. Even tribes that lived hundreds of miles inland, far outside of Yaupon's natural coastal growing zone, traded heavily for dried bundles of the leaves.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and look at the archaeological evidence gathered in these FIU studies, it is absolutely stunning. Let's talk about the ancient Mississippian metropolis of Cahokia.
For those who aren't familiar, Cahokia was located just across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis. At its peak, around 1050 CE, it was one of the largest and most complex cities in the world, featuring massive earthen pyramids, bustling plazas, and a population that rivaled contemporary European capitals like London or Paris.
And during the extensive excavations of Cahokia's mounds and residential sectors, archaeologists kept unearthing these very distinctive small, round, ceramic beakers. They were beautifully crafted, featuring a small handle on one side and a tiny pouring lip on the other, heavily decorated with intricate, incised motifs representing water and the underworld.
And these specific beakers date back to the civilization's peak, between 1050 and 1250 CE. But the obvious question is, how do modern scientists know what was inside a cup that someone drank out of almost 1,000 years ago?
The answer is advanced residue testing. Researchers carefully scraped the microscopic unglazed pores on the inside of these ancient clay beakers and ran the residue through mass spectrometry.
The chemical signatures they found were unmistakable. The clay had absorbed and preserved theobromine, caffeine, and a specific biomarker called ursolic acid. Crucially, these compounds were present in the exact, unique chemical ratios that correspond exclusively to Ilex vomitoria.
Keep in mind the geography here. Cahokia is in modern-day Illinois. That is, hundreds of miles north of where Yaupon can survive the winter cold.
Right, because it's a southern coastal plant.
This single discovery proves that there was a massive, highly organized, and relentless trade network established specifically to transport massive quantities of this caffeinated leaf up the Mississippi River on canoes to supply a sprawling metropolis.
And those trade networks extended much further west than the Mississippi River, didn't they?
They did. Recent chemical analyses have discovered residues with methylxanthine ratios, which is the scientific classification for these specific alkaloid stimulants matching Yaupon deep inside pottery recovered from ancestral Puebloan sites.
We are talking about locations like Pueblo Bonito in the arid climate of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. That is an astonishing geographical distance.
To move a coastal, swamp-loving plant across the Great Plains and into the high deserts of New Mexico, prior to the invention of the wheel or the introduction of the horse, is a monumental logistical feat.
It proves a continent-spanning, insatiable demand for this specific plant. It was the ancient equivalent of the global coffee trade.
Understanding the scale of the trade requires understanding how they actually prepared and consumed it, because the ceremonial aspect was complex and highly formalized.
Now, how did they prepare it?
The indigenous peoples would harvest the branches, often meticulously selecting the leaves right before they planned to use them to ensure maximum potency. They would then take the fresh leaves and parch them.
Parching, meaning essentially lightly roasting them in a large, unglazed ceramic container directly over an open fire.
Yes, and this parching process is chemically brilliant, even if they didn't have the modern terminology to describe it. By exposing the leaves to dry heat, they were breaking down the cellular structure and increasing the solubility of the caffeine and theobromine in water.
Functioning much like the process of roasting raw green coffee beans does today.
Following the roasting, they would submerge the leaves in large clay pots of water and boil them relentlessly. They wouldn't just steep it like modern tea, they would actively boil the liquid until it reduced down into a highly concentrated, incredibly potent, dark infusion.
And many native peoples referred to this profound brew as the white drink, utilizing the color white metaphorically to symbolize purity, spiritual cleansing, and peace. However, European observers later dubbed it the black drink, due simply to its dark, opaque, coffee-like visual appearance.
Because they drank it incredibly hot, and because caffeine is exponentially more soluble in boiling water than in warm water, this highly concentrated, reduced decoction delivered a massive, staggering dose of caffeine.
We're talking about a stimulant rush far stronger and more immediate than a modern shot of espresso.
This powerful brew was central to their most important socio-religious rituals, most notably the green corn ceremony, which was a vital annual festival of renewal, forgiveness, and spiritual purification, marking the beginning of the new harvest.
The cultural impact of the black drink was so profound that it literally shaped the names and identities of major historical figures. I love this historical linguistic detail from the source material.
It's fascinating.
If you know anything about 19th century American history, you know the name of the famous Seminole leader, Osceola, who bravely resisted the forced removal of his people from Florida. But Osceola is not actually his name.
No, it's not.
It is an English phonetic corruption of his actual Seminole title, Osceola. And when you translate Osceola into English, it literally means black drink singer.
It was a title indicating his prominent, highly respected role as the leader who directed the singing and the intricate rituals during the sacred black drink ceremonies.
That single linguistic detail shows how deeply, inextricably embedded Yaupon was in the social, political, and spiritual fabric of Indigenous American life. It was arguably the most beloved sacred plant on the continent.
But then the timeline shifts.
Right. The Europeans arrive on the shores of the Americas. And what followed was a massive, historically tragic misunderstanding compounded by what looks suspiciously like early corporate espionage that effectively cursed this magnificent plant's reputation for centuries. We have to address the giant, ugly Latin elephant in the room.
We do. And that elephant is the official binomial nomenclature, the scientific name permanently attached to the plant. Ilex vomitoria.
So what does this all mean? How does a plant that provides a remarkably smooth, crash-free, soothing tea, a plant with zero toxins and incredible health benefits, get saddled with the horrifying word vomitoria in the permanent scientific record?
Well, the name was officially coined and published in 1789 by William Ayton, who was a prominent Scottish botanist serving as the director of the famous Kew Gardens in London.
But Ayton didn't just pull the name out of thin air, did he?
No, he based that terrifying Latin classification on the lurid, often sensationalized reports sent back by early European explorers and colonists in the Americas. These European observers have been granted access to witness the highly sacred indigenous purification ceremonies, like the green corn ceremony we mentioned.
And during these specific, highly formalized rituals, the European writers watched as indigenous participants would drink massive ceremonial quantities of the scalding hot black drink and then shortly after intentionally and violently vomit as a physical manifestation of spiritual cleansing, purging themselves of the previous year's sins and impurities.
The visual was shocking to the European sensibilities, and they immediately linked the vomiting directly to the plant itself. But here is the crucial biological reality that the European observers completely missed, and that modern science has had to spend decades correcting. The vomiting was not caused by the Yaupon leaves.
Let's think about the biological reality of the human body for a second. If you force anyone, regardless of their background, to undergo a multi-day spiritual fast, and then have them rapidly chug a gallon of boiling hot, incredibly bitter, highly caffeinated liquid on an entirely empty, shrunken stomach, the body's natural, unavoidable physiological reflex is going to be to forcefully expel it.
The stomach simply cannot handle that volume of hot liquid under those conditions. It's a volume issue, not a toxicity issue.
Furthermore, modern ethnobotanists and historians strongly suspect that for these specific rare purification rituals, the indigenous shamans intentionally added other genuinely emetic herbs to the ceremonial brew to guarantee the purging effect.
The most likely candidate is a plant called Eryngium usifolium, which goes by the incredibly metal and descriptive common name rattlesnake master. That plant will absolutely make you sick.
Let's be unequivocally clear for anyone listening who is worried about trying this tea. Extensive modern chemical analysis conducted by the USDA and multiple independent university laboratories has confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that there are absolutely zero emetic or toxic compounds in Yaupon leaves.
None. Zero. Drinking it will not make you sick.
It makes you feel fantastic, focused, and healthy. But the 18th century European observers didn't have mass spectrometers. They saw the ritual, they saw the vomiting, they wrote it down in their journals, and William Ayton slapped the name Ilex vomitoria on the plant forever.
This historical sequence raises a very important, highly debated question in botanical circles, though. Was this merely an innocent, albeit tragic, scientific misunderstanding based on flawed observational data, or was something much more nefarious, calculated, and economically driven at play?
Because if we look at the historical timeline, by the mid-18th century, decades before Ayton named it, Yaupon was actually becoming quite a popular, trendy export in Europe.
It was.
I love a good historical true crime conspiracy, especially when it involves global trade monopolies. Let's talk about the British East India Company.
To understand the motive, we have to look at the meticulous diary of Johann David Schupp an 18th century German botanist and physician who traveled extensively through the American colonies and kept incredible records of the local flora and economy.
And in his writings, he noted that Yaupon tea was being actively exported by colonists and had become quite a hit in the trendy cafes and salons of Europe.
It was being heavily marketed under much more appealing names. In London, the high society crowds were drinking it and calling it South Seas tea or Carolina tea. Across the channel in Paris, it was highly sought after under the name Appellation.
Schupf noted an incredibly tense economic dynamic. At this exact time in history, the British East India Company was arguably the most powerful corporate entity on the planet. They practically controlled the global economy through their absolute iron-fisted monopoly on the importation of Asian tea from China and India.
The logistics of moving tea from Asia to London on wooden sailing ships was staggeringly expensive, and the profits were astronomical.
Now imagine the sheer panic in the boardroom of the East India Company. They suddenly realize that their primary consumer base in Europe is developing a taste for an abundant, incredibly hardy, native plant that grows completely free and wild across millions of acres in the American South.
If Carolina tea took over the market, the East India Company's primary revenue stream would be decimated overnight. They had a massive financial incentive to destroy the reputation of this American alternative.
Which leads many modern ecologists and historians, including prominent researchers like Francis Pitts at the University of Florida, to speculate that the formal scientific naming of the plant wasn't an accident.
They argue that William Ayton, working at the Royal Kew Gardens, an institution deeply intertwined with the British Empire's economic interests, intentionally weaponized the lurid tales of indigenous vomiting to create a calculated smear campaign.
It is brilliant, absolutely devastating marketing. Think about it from a consumer perspective. You are an aristocrat in London browsing a tea shop. Are you going to buy the exotic, expensive Camellia sinensis from the mystical mountains of China? Or are you going to buy the cheap colonial import that the royal botanist just officially classified as vomit tea?
It completely killed its commercial appeal in Europe almost instantly.
Whether it was a deliberate corporate conspiracy orchestrated by the East India Company to protect their monopoly, or just a tragic, stubborn scientific error that refused to be corrected, the ugly Latin name stuck permanently.
But interestingly enough, the smear campaign didn't immediately kill the plant's daily use in North America among the people who actually lived alongside it.
The early colonists and settlers initially embraced it out of sheer necessity and observation. They saw how healthy and energetic the native populations were. In 1615, a Spanish priest living in an early colonial settlement in Florida wrote a letter back to Europe detailing daily life, and he explicitly stated, "There is no Spaniard or Indian who does not drink it every day in the morning or evening."
They recognized its value immediately as a reliable, comforting daily habit, and it had a massive, fiercely patriotic moment a century and a half later.
Fast forward to the years leading up to the American Revolution. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the infamous Tea Act, imposing heavy taxes and tightening the East India Company's monopoly.
This led directly to the Boston Tea Party and sparked a massive, colony-wide, highly organized boycott of all British imported Asian tea.
If you are a colonist who is fundamentally addicted to a morning caffeine habit, but drinking British tea is suddenly viewed as an act of treason against the revolution, what do you drink instead?
They turned right back to the woods. The colonists aggressively harvested Yaupon and patriotically rebranded it in the newspapers and taverns as Liberty Tea.
If you were a true revolutionary patriot living anywhere in the American South, you were starting your day with a hot, defiant cup of native Yaupon.
It experienced another major, culturally significant resurgence nearly a century later during the American Civil War. Early in the conflict, the Union Navy implemented the Anaconda Plan, a devastatingly strict naval blockade of all southern ports.
This effectively severed all international supply lines, cutting off all shipments of imported coffee from South America and tea from Asia to the Confederacy.
Out of sheer desperate necessity, Southerners turned back to the dense woods and swamps. Yaupon once again became a vital, life-sustaining daily substitute to keep a war-torn population caffeinated and functioning.
The historical agricultural records indicate that the demand was so high that nearly every rural farm and large plantation in the South maintained a dedicated, carefully pruned Yaupon nursery during this period just to ensure a steady supply of morning caffeine.
So we see this incredible pattern of resilience. It survived the smear campaign of the Revolution. It served as the backbone of American caffeine during the Civil War blockades.
Which raises the ultimate question. Why, then, did it completely disappear from the American diet in the 20th century? Why aren't there Yaupon cafes on every corner instead of coffee shops?
The fall from grace, as detailed in these sociological and historical sources, was a deeply complex, tragic mix of rapidly shifting socioeconomic realities, the reopening of global supply chains, and incredibly toxic class and racial stigmas.
As the late 19th and early 20th centuries progressed, global trade routes normalized and expanded exponentially with the advent of steamships.
Imported coffee from Brazil and Colombia and traditional tea from China and India became widely available, cheaper to import, and most importantly, heavily marketed by massive corporations. These imported beverages rapidly became powerful cultural status symbols in America.
Serving imported Asian tea in fine china, or brewing expensive South American coffee beans, signaled to your guests that you had disposable income, sophisticated taste, and strong connections to the modern globalized market.
Meanwhile, Yaupon just grew wild in the dirt. It was literally free. You didn't need to go to a fancy mercantile to buy it. You just had to walk outside into the scrubland and strip a few branches.
Because it was free, abundant, and required no money to acquire, it rapidly became heavily associated with deep rural poverty. It was viewed dismissively as the drink of people who couldn't afford real imported coffee or tea.
And in the heavily stratified, segregated society of the American South, during the Jim Crow era, that economic stigma quickly morphed into a racial and class stigma.
Yaupon use became deeply associated with marginalized groups, particularly poor Southern Black populations, who had adopted its use from indigenous traditions and continued to utilize it daily as an accessible folk medicine and beverage, alongside deeply impoverished rural white tenant farmers.
The rising white middle and upper classes in the South desperately wanted to distance themselves from those associations of poverty and marginalization. To prove their social standing and modernity, they completely abandoned the native plant.
They actively chose to pay a premium for imported, inferior-tasting coffee simply because of what it represented socially. That is just heartbreaking on a cultural level. A plant with an 8,000-year history of deep spiritual reverence is casually discarded and allowed to rot in the woods because of a bad Latin name and terrible systemic societal prejudice.
There was a brief glimmer of hope in the 1920s. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, recognizing the insane trade deficit caused by importing thousands of tons of coffee, actually tried to revive Yaupon. They spent money studying it as a cheap, domestic economic alternative.
They even set up tasting booths and served it to crowds at the massive Charleston County Fair in South Carolina, desperately trying to generate commercial interest among farmers.
But the stigma was simply too deep-rooted. People tasted it, liked it, and then refused to buy it because of what their neighbors might think. By the 1970s, the cultural erasure was practically complete.
To put that into perspective, the ethnobotanical records from FIU note that in 1973, researchers could only locate a single commercial establishment in the entire United States that still served Yaupon tea.
Just one.
It was a tiny diner called the Pony Island Restaurant, located on the remote, isolated community of Ocracoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. And that was it. The 8,000-year empire was reduced to a single coastal diner.
It was as close to total cultural extinction as a plant can get without actually dying off biologically. But the beauty of nature is that it doesn't care about human trends or stigmas. A plant this biologically resilient, this perfectly adapted to the harsh southern landscape, and containing this many incredible biochemical benefits, was never going to stay hidden forever. The story absolutely does not end in the 1970s.
No, it doesn't. And this is where the dark historical clouds part, and we get to the glorious redemption arc. Welcome to the 21st century Yaupon Renaissance. In the early 2000s, a slow trickle of curious foragers, sustainable farmers, and small startup companies started looking at the dense woods and ranchlands in the South and realizing exactly what was growing right in front of them. The momentum built quietly for 2 decades until we hit 2023, when Whole Foods officially named Yaupon as a #1 national food trend, placing it firmly in the mainstream spotlight.
The modern pioneers driving this incredible revival are fascinating because they all approach the plan with a deep sense of respect and mission. You have pioneering companies like Cat Spring Yaupon out of Texas.
They have a great origin story.
They do.
Yeah.
They were founded by 2 sisters who had spent their entire lives treating Yaupon as a nuisance weed that they were constantly trying to clear from their family's cattle ranch with bulldozers. Then a massive drought killed everything on the ranch except the vibrant green Yaupon.
They researched it, realized they were sitting on a historical superfood, and pivoted their entire operation to harvesting it.
Then you have incredible, socially conscious, mission-driven operations like Rise Yaupon down in Florida. They aren't just selling tea, they are actively trying to heal their community.
They donate $1 from every single bag or canister they sell to specific charities that help feed impoverished and homeless children in their state. On top of that, their entire agricultural workforce is built on hiring second-chance employees, people overcoming addiction or incarceration, paying them a genuine living wage to harvest and process the leaves.
You also have dedicated traditionalists like Lost Pines Yaupon Tea, also operating out of the unique ecosystem of Bastrop, Texas. They are hyper-focused on keeping the ancient, traditional Native American roasting and decoction methods alive, treating the plant with historical reverence.
And on the modern commercial scaling side, you have newer, ambitious players like Gold Holly, based up in New York. Gold Holly was founded by Liam Trotsuk, and his origin story perfectly captures the modern sense of discovery.
He wasn't a farmer, right?
Yeah. No, he was working in corporate aviation network planning for JetBlue. He happened to be on a work trip in Texas, visited the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin on a whim, tasted a sample of Yaupon tea, and was completely blown away by the flavor and the smooth energy.
He looked around and couldn't believe this wasn't already a massive billion-dollar domestic industry. He immediately saw the gap in the market.
Gold Holly's trajectory really highlights the massive economic and logistical potential we are looking at. Recognizing that taking a wild foraged plant into mainstream grocery stores requires serious infrastructure, they partnered directly with the Cornell Food Venture Center and the Center of Excellence for Food and Agriculture in New York.
They utilized Cornell's world-class agricultural scientists to meticulously navigate the incredibly complex webs of FDA food safety regulations, co-manufacturing logistics, nutritional analysis, and scaling a supply chain.
They are actively doing the heavy lifting to take Yaupon from a quaint niche farmer's market curiosity to a standardized, mainstream morning staple found in every pantry.
And the timing for this commercial push could not possibly be better. Because Yaupon isn't just a great underdog story with a smooth caffeine kick. It is an absolute, undeniable environmental champion.
If you are a consumer who cares deeply about climate change, water conservation, and sustainability, the research is clear. This is the most environmentally friendly, ecologically sound caffeine source you can possibly consume in North America. Full stop.
The agricultural profile is completely unparalleled when compared to imported crops. Because Yaupon has spent millions of years evolving natively in these specific, harsh southern ecosystems, it is perfectly biologically adapted to the environment.
That means to cultivate it commercially, it requires zero synthetic chemical pesticides to thrive the bugs already know to leave it alone.
It requires zero artificial chemical fertilizers to grow rapidly.
Yeah.
And perhaps most importantly, in an era of terrifying water scarcity, it requires absolutely no artificial irrigation. It survives and thrives purely on the natural rainfall of the region.
It is incredibly stubbornly tough. It is highly drought-resistant, meaning it survives Texas summers without blinking. It can survive freezing winter temperatures that would instantly kill a coffee plant.
And it's even highly tolerant of heavy salt spray, which is why it thrives so aggressively along the immediate coastlines and on the sandy barrier islands of the Carolinas, where nothing else will grow.
Let's frame this by looking at the environmental reality of our current habits. Think about the massive, hidden carbon footprint of your standard morning cup of coffee. The beans are typically grown on recently deforested, ecologically devastated land in South America, Africa, or Southeast Asia.
Growing those beans requires massive, unsustainable amounts of fresh water, heavily synthesized chemical fertilizers, and often exploitative labor practices.
And that's just the growing phase. Once harvested, those heavy raw green beans are packed into massive shipping containers and transported thousands of miles across the ocean on massive cargo ships burning dirty bunker fuel.
They are offloaded at a port, trucked to a massive industrial roasting facility, packaged in plastic, and trucked again to your local grocery store. The emissions footprint is staggering.
But if you live in the United States and you consciously choose to switch to Yaupon, you are drastically, instantly slashing that massive carbon footprint down to almost nothing.
In fact, the environmental math gets even better. When you look at the regenerative farming and wild harvesting models employed by companies like CatSpring and Rise Yaupon, the carbon footprint isn't just low, it is often effectively negative.
Let's break down how that is possible, because carbon-negative farming sounds like a marketing buzzword. How does harvesting a plant actually help the ecosystem?
It comes down to a botanical concept called coppicing, combined with the plant's unique biology. These companies aren't bringing in heavy machinery and clear-cutting ancient forests. They are meticulously wild harvesting. The standard, strict ethical practice among these modern growers is to never, ever take more than 50% of the leaf volume from any single tree at a given time.
So they essentially just give the bush a heavy haircut and move on.
Exactly. And here is where the biology kicks in. Yaupon grows in incredibly dense, sprawling communities called thickets. These thickets are deeply interconnected underground by incredibly elaborate, vast root systems that store massive amounts of carbon deep in the soil.
When human foragers selectively prune or harvest the top of the plant, that massive undisturbed root system senses the loss of foliage and immediately kicks into overdrive.
It rapidly pumps nutrients upward to regenerate the missing leaves, growing back thicker and healthier than before.
So by continually sustainably pruning the top layer, you are actually stimulating the overall health, density, and carbon sequestering power of the entire thicket, while leaving the surrounding ecosystem, the soil microbiome, and the wildlife habitats entirely intact and undisturbed. It is the definition of a regenerative cycle.
It is a massive win for the environment, a profound win for your personal physical health, and an emerging massive potential win for the American agricultural economy. In the Cornell research, Liam Trotzuk from Gold Holly pointed out a staggering economic statistic. The traditional and specialty dried tea market in the United States is currently a $4 billion industry, and almost 100% of that money flows out of the country to import Asian tea.
Right now, we are looking at an incredibly volatile global market with looming international tariffs, shipping route disruptions, and climate change threatening to massively hike the retail price of imported coffee and tea. A domestic climate-resilient caffeine crop like Yaupon is perfectly positioned to step in and fill that void.
Capturing just a tiny fraction, say, 1% of that massive market instantly creates a $40 million domestic industry. That is money that stays local, supports American farmers, revitalizes rural economies, and champions regenerative agriculture.
The economic catalyst is certainly there, and the market forces are aligning perfectly. We are looking at a single native plant that simultaneously solves fragile supply chain issues, desperate environmental concerns, and shifting consumer health demands all at once.
All right, if you have been listening to this incredible history and you are thoroughly convinced you're ready to ditch that bitter, anxiety-inducing afternoon coffee and try this native super tea for yourself, you need the practical details.
You need to know exactly how it is processed, how to forage it yourself if you are feeling adventurous, and exactly what flavor profile to expect when you finally pour it into your cup.
If you choose to go the adventurous route and forage it yourself from the local woods, you must be precise and respectful of the plant. Again, look for those straight, light, silvery gray stems. The deep green leaves should be staggered, meaning they alternate and aren't growing directly opposite each other on the stem, and they absolutely must have those blunt, non-prickly, sawtooth, serrated edges.
And I cannot stress this enough, if you are foraging in the winter, meticulously pick out any bright red berries from your harvest basket.
There is a really fascinating botanical defense mechanism that modern foragers and ancient indigenous peoples both understood perfectly. What's fascinating here is when you are out in the woods harvesting, you don't just strip the whole branch. You want to specifically focus your efforts on plucking the bright, new, soft, young growth at the very tips of the branches.
Why? Because laboratory testing proves that the new, young leaves have a significantly, measurably higher caffeine concentration than the older, darker, mature leaves closer to the trunk.
It is a brilliant, ruthless evolutionary adaptation. Think about it from the plant's perspective. The fresh young leaves at the tips are the most valuable asset for the plant's continued growth and photosynthesis. But because they are soft and tender, they're also the most vulnerable to being eaten by hungry insects.
To protect its most valuable asset, the plant naturally pumps those specific tender leaves full of potent alkaloids, specifically caffeine. Because, while caffeine wakes us up to a tiny insect, a high dose of caffeine acts as a highly toxic, paralyzing natural insecticide. It scrambles their nervous system.
Precisely. It is a natural bug spray. Indigenous groups, through thousands of years of careful observation, understood this dynamic intuitively. They didn't need a mass spectrometer to know that if they wanted to brew the absolute strongest, most potent ceremonial black drink, they needed to specifically target those bright green young shoots.
Nature is just Brutally brilliant. Now, once you have your harvested leaves, or let's be honest, much more likely, once you tear open the beautifully packaged bag you just bought online from one of these great revival companies, you have a few different roast profiles to choose from.
Much like the world of specialty coffee, the specific roasting process radically alters the chemical structure and completely changes the final flavor profile in your mug. The diversity of flavor you can get from this single leaf is remarkable.
Let's walk through the three main roast profiles you'll encounter. First, you have the air-dried or green roast.
In this method, instead of applying any external heat, the freshly harvested leaves are simply tumbled or spun and then left to dry slowly in the open air, often in the shade.
This very gentle process produces a very mild, incredibly smooth, crisp tea. It retains delicate, fresh, grassy notes and has a bright, clean, earthy finish. It is incredibly refreshing, often compared to a super premium Japanese sencha green tea, but crucially, completely without the harsh astringency.
The folks at Cat Spring call their version of this Pedernales Green, heavily inspired by the clear, limestone-filtered waters of the Pedernales River in Texas. It is the perfect iced tea for a brutally hot summer day.
Stepping up from there, you have the medium roast. In this process, the dried leaves are gently baked in an oven, perhaps at around 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 40 minutes.
This moderate heat begins to caramelize the natural sugars inside the leaf, bringing out a beautiful golden mellow color in the brewed liquid.
The flavor profile shifts dramatically here. You lose the grassy notes and start getting these wonderful warm caramel, subtle raisin, and toasted nut undertones. It is deeply comforting, incredibly smooth, and absolutely perfect for a cool, crisp autumn morning.
Finally, for the heavy hitters, you have the dark roast. The leaves are exposed to significantly higher temperatures, often pushed to around 400 degrees for a carefully monitored, shorter period.
This aggressive roasting yields a rich, deeply toasty, incredibly robust flavor that is almost coffee-like in its dark complexity. It developed a profound, earthy depth, subtle hints of dark chocolate, which makes sense given the theobromine content, and a dark, opaque color that appeals heavily to dedicated, hardcore coffee drinkers who are desperately looking to make a healthy switch, but still want a drink that feels substantial and weighty on the palate.
Now, the most critical part of this entire process is how you actually brew it at home. Because Yaupon is physically and chemically different from delicate Asian green tea, you cannot treat it the same way. The standard, everyday steep is simple but requires one absolute rule. Use about 1 teaspoon of crushed or ground leaves, but you must steep them in rapidly boiling water for a minimum of 5 minutes.
I really want to emphasize that temperature requirement for the listeners. You don't want water from a lukewarm kettle, and you don't want water that is just steaming hot. It needs to be aggressively, actively boiling at 212 degrees.
Why? Because Yaupon leaves, having evolved to survive droughts and freezes, are incredibly thick, leathery, and physically tough. Far tougher than the delicate, papery leaves of traditional Camellia sinensis tea.
The rolling, boiling water is absolutely mechanically necessary to break down those rigid cellular walls and fully efficiently extract the caffeine, the theobromine, and all those wonderful health-promoting antioxidants trapped inside.
And here is where we circle back to the absolute best feature of this plant. Because it completely lacks tannins, you do not have to worry for a single second about the boiling water, scalding the leaves, and turning the brew terribly bitter.
Scalding the leaves is the cardinal, unforgivable sin of brewing delicate green tea. But Yaupon is essentially bulletproof. You can literally just drop a tea bag or a metal infuser full of loose, dark roast directly into your favorite mug, pour a rolling boil over it, and just leave the leaves in there all morning while you work.
As you slowly drink it down over the course of an hour, you can just keep topping the mug off with more hot water from a furnace. Because the leaves are so dense with compounds, you can easily get 3 or 4 very strong, flavorful cups out of a single 1 teaspoon serving of leaves before the flavor finally starts to fade. It is incredibly economical.
But if you really want to experience the true, unbridled power of Yaupon, the way it was historically consumed by the indigenous elites and warriors, you have to try the traditional decoction method on your stovetop. This is the authentic Native American way, and the purists at Lost Pines highly recommend it, particularly for their dark roast. It requires a bit more effort, but the payoff is immense.
Here's the exact process for the traditional decoction. Take 1 full, heaping tablespoon of finely ground dark roast Yaupon for every cup of water you plan to drink. Put the cold water in a saucepan on your stove and bring it to a violent rolling boil. Once the water is churning, carefully dump the dry leaves directly into the boiling water.
I have tried this at home, and you have to be very careful at this exact stage because the moment those dry, roasted leaves hit the boiling water, the mixture will violently froth up, almost like a dark beer head, and it can easily boil over the side of your pot and ruin your stove. You have to stir it constantly and immediately turn the heat dial down to maintain a strong, steady, gentle simmer without boiling over.
You want to let that mixture actively simmer and churn on the heat for a full 5 to 10 minutes. That heavy, continuous boiling agitation is doing the necessary work. It is physically beating the leaves, breaking open every last cell, and extracting the absolute maximum, highly concentrated amount of dark flavor, pure caffeine, and theobromine into the water.
After 5 minutes of simmering, turn off the heat completely. Let the pot sit for a minute so the heavy, wet leaves naturally sink to the bottom. Then, gently and slowly pour the dark, rich liquid through a fine mesh strainer directly into your favorite mug.
What you are left with is an incredibly robust, nearly pitch-black brew that is thick, aromatic, and serves as the ultimate jitter-free morning eye-opener. It has the visual weight and mouthfeel of a French press coffee, but with the chemical synergy we discussed earlier.
You can drink it black to appreciate the earthy, toasty notes, or you can add a generous splash of oat milk or a heavy drizzle of local honey if you prefer a sweeter start to your day. It handles additions beautifully. Drink that, and you are fully equipped and ready to conquer the world with absolute certainty that you will not suffer that miserable 2 p.m. crash.
Whether your ultimate goal today is simply to head to a native plant nursery and plant a beautiful bird-friendly Pride of Houston or weeping Yaupon cultivar in your front yard to support the local ecosystem, or you just desperately want a healthier, more sustainable, crash-free energy boost to get you through your brutal workday, Yaupon is an absolutely extraordinary, miraculous plant.
And the wildest part is, it has just been sitting out there in the woods waiting patiently for generations for us to finally pull our heads out of the sand and rediscover it.
The story of Yaupon perfectly encapsulates the danger of historical ignorance, but also the incredible redemptive power of modern ecological awareness. To sum up this incredible, sprawling journey, we have traveled from the bustling plazas of an 8,000-year-old indigenous trade empire spanning the entire North American continent, down through a catastrophic, devastating European botanical misunderstanding and deep-seated systemic class stigmas that successfully, nearly permanently, erased a vital cultural staple from our collective memory.
And now, against all odds, we are actively witnessing and participating in a vibrant, modern, regenerative agricultural movement. Passionate farmers, socially conscious entrepreneurs, and curious consumers are successfully reviving the continent's only native caffeine source, bringing it out of the shadows and back onto the main stage where it belongs.
The actionable takeaway here is simple. The very next time you groggily reach for a cup of imported mass-produced morning coffee, or steep a bag of imported Asian green tea, take a brief moment to remember that you actually have an alternative. You have a powerful native option that directly, tangibly supports local ecosystems and rural American farmers.
An option that requires 0 toxic pesticides, slashes your carbon footprint to 0, and gives you a chemically superior, smoother, longer-lasting energy lift. Most importantly, it is a daily habit that connects you directly to the ancient, profound, and deeply rooted history of the very land you are standing on.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today as you go about your business. We have just spent the last hour meticulously uncovering the hidden story of a single plant, a plant with an impeccable 8,000-year pedigree, proven chemically superior health benefits, and absolutely perfect environmental sustainability.
And yet, despite all of those massive, undeniable advantages, it was almost entirely erased from our modern culture just because of one stubborn, bad scientific name and a handful of outdated, tragic, completely arbitrary class stigmas.
If a plant this miraculous, this useful, and this deeply ingrained in the landscape can be completely ignored, growing completely wild right under our noses while we spend billions importing inferior alternatives from across the globe, what other incredible, life-changing native plants, medicines, and superfoods are growing quietly in our own backyards right now, completely forgotten by modern society, just waiting for someone curious enough to rediscover them?
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Stay curious, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.